Hi guys, so last time we left off we were talking about photosystems 1 and 2 in which photons of light were coming down and interacting with the chlorophyll A and the chlorophyll B, and through a series of chemical reactions we ended up with two big energy molecules. One is that NADPH and two is the ATP. So remember, this is a biogeochemical cycle, and a biogeochemical cycle is where the products of one reaction are used as the reactants in the next. So we're going to use these two energy molecules in what's called the Calvin cycle. So the next part of photosynthesis is called the Calvin cycle. It's named after a guy named Melvin Calvin. And it looks like this. So remember that this was happening in the thylakoid, right? So we had all this NADPH coming out of the thylakoid, and into the stroma, right? So now we're in the stroma. So we have all this NADPH it just floating around that's coming out from inside the thylakoid. Well, I shouldn't say it's coming, but the H's are coming from inside the thylakoid membrane through the proton pump, and that is donating the energy from the electron transport chain to fuse an ADP plus an H together. So this is this high energy molecule. In addition, we get some ATP in the same fashion. So we've got all this NADPH in a high concentration out here in our stroma. And because these are molecules that are floating around in the stroma, it's like that cytoplasmy stuff, they're going to interact with each other. So we've got a couple of key players. We have something called RUBP, and that is just a molecule of a substance that the plant makes on its own in a totally different process, so we're not going to talk about it in here. RUBP comes along and it's in high concentration, dissolved in the stroma, and it interacts with CO2. And our CO2, that's really bad CO2, but our CO2 came from the atmosphere. Remember, it's going from a high concentration, and because it's a nonpolar molecule, it can move all the way down through the stoma, into the phloem, and then into the cell, and then in the cell it's going to actually diffuse right into the into the chloroplast, and it's going to come into contact with RUBP, and a chemical reaction is going to occur, and it just makes a substance called PGA. And that happens all on its own. It doesn't need any energy. It just naturally breaks down to a substance called PGA, and then I'm sure some other substances too. Now, PGA needs to turn into something else, but this time it's not as easy. We've actually got to do some energy to get it to go from PGA to PGAL. So I needed to move from PGA to PGAL, and in order to do this, I need a little bit of ATP and a little bit of NADPH. Well, where did I get those from? I got those from photosystems 1 and 2. Remember, those were the products of the reaction. Now they're the reactants of the next reaction. So I need these in order to break down, or to build up PGAL from PGA. Okay? So I'm going to use these, and it's going to break down some ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, into some ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. So all it did was lose a phosphate group, and because it lost a phosphate group, it released some energy, and that energy is then used to bond some molecules together. The same thing happens here. NADPH will break down naturally. It's an unstable molecule. The H will come off, and it will break down to NAD plus another H molecule. So that's just it's just releasing an element from or a molecule from this bigger molecule. And because those were bonded together, they release electrons because that's what holds all things together. And those electrons are then donated, or the energy is donated to transform PGA to PGAl. So now I have some PGAl. Now the next easy thing is that PGAl will easily break down back down to RUBP, and this whole cycle can keep going. As long as I have CO2 from the atmosphere, I can keep this whole cycle going. What's really cool about this stuff is that I get some, the big thing is I get some simple sugars out of this, 3 carbon simple sugars, so the glucose that I really need out of it. But to get PGAl back to RUBP, I do need a little bit more ATP, and again that ATP came from photosystems 1 and 2, so the same thing happens here. I take adenosine triphosphate, break off the phosphate group, and it goes down to adenosine diphosphate. In the process of donating that phosphate group, I now release electrons, and those electrons can be used to push this further along. Okay, so now I have, this is the part that's really important, because the whole point of photosynthesis is to make glucose. I really need glucose, and that's why I have it big and in red. So I need glucose in order to keep the next phase going until I actually make something called ATP. In the process of doing that, I also get some other cool things, some amino acids, some other carbs, and some lipids. And those are definitely valuable, and I need them, but I don't need them to continue photosynthesis and cellular respiration. I need glucose. So glucose is a really important molecule to understand that I need. Okay, so that's the Calvin cycle. It's pretty simple. So let's talk about the start with, the ends with, and the biogeochemical cycles. So it started with RUBP and CO2, and it ended with glucose. Some other things too, but glucose is what I really care about. So it ended with glucose. Okay. And my biogeochemical cycle was the fact that so the first part of it was that NADPH and ATP came in and were used to make glucose. 2, glucose is going to be used in the next step, which is called glycolysis. So lysis means the breaking of, and it refers to glycogen or glucose, and so it's the breaking of glucose down. And this is happening inside the stroma. So the stroma, remember, is just the cytoplasm-like substance inside the chloroplast. So that's the Calvin cycle. So now what you guys should get is that photosystems 1 and 2, activated by the sun, by those photons of light, split water molecules and broke those down into a substance, or broke down water and transferred that energy to make a substance called NADPH and ATP. That ATP and NADPH was used here in the Calvin cycle to help combine certain elements or molecules together to make a special molecule called glucose. So that's really the ultimate reason for having photosynthesis, is to make glucose.